Hello, Phil here from Wings of Pegasus and welcome to another analysis video. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe. On the agenda tonight, we're going back to 1965. We're going to be taking a look at Peter, Paul and Mary, and they're going to be performing Blowing in the Wind. And this video has the subtitles or the lyrics on screen, which I always find helpful, especially with classic folk singer-songwriter type songs. But also, I am going to be stopping this video midway through, so if you want to watch the video without being interrupted, the link's going to be in the description below, as always. But let's get these guys up on screen and see how they get on.
Must the cannonballs fly before they're forever banned? The answer, my friend, is blowing in the wind. The answer is blowing in the wind. How many years can a mountain exist before it is washed to the sea? How many years can some people exist before they're allowed to be free? How many times can a man turn his head and pretend that he just doesn't see?
I'm just going to jump in here because this is a good video to be looking at around this time. I've recently done the Mamas and the Papas, and having those ranges that just complement each other, as we have here with Peter, Paul and Mary, because we've got the contralto range that Mary has, which just sits it in that same range as Peter's tenor range that he's got. So those notes are going to overlap. So sometimes Peter is actually singing above Mary in terms of pitch. Just in case you haven't seen the previous videos where I explain the ranges, contralto is the lowest of the female range and tenor is the highest of the male range. And the male tenor range ends at A4, but anything above that is still classed as the tenor range. So those notes will overlap with the lowest of that female range as well. So that's why we get the mix of exactly the same notes, even though they're called different ranges. One goes a lot higher, like contralto, but if guys are singing really high, they're not called contralto, they're still called tenor. That's their range that they're singing in. Like I said, anything above A4 is still classed as a tenor for a male. But then also when we get into Paul's baritone voice, his range, that's where it sits, is going to be underneath these other two voices that are interacting with each other. So we've definitely got an interesting mix here. It all really does come together so well. And I know that Paul's name is Noel Paul, and I'm going to be calling him Paul just for the sake of this video because it is Peter, Paul and Mary. The first thing to point out is starting the performance playing the guitars. This is something that just happened back in the day, 1965 here. You had to be able to play an instrument and sing in order to accompany yourself, and that's exactly what we've got here with Peter, starting with this finger style playing, but he's only using the thumb and the first finger in order to get that finger style sound. And it's something that you do see quite a lot where players just apply enough picking to make it melodic. We've also got, of course, Paul playing the other guitar, supplying the chords, so it isn't really important to get that second finger and third finger involved on the right hand and go through too many complex sequences. So it's just something to break up the chords or arpeggiate the chords with the picking that Peter's throwing together, and then Paul can just have that underlying chord structure underneath and just play through the progression. The most important thing about this performance, because it's so stripped back, just 3 voices and 2 guitars, are the dynamics and that dynamic range that they're covering, and that is how they are approaching this performance. And you can tell how important it is to get the right distance from the mic. For example, when Peter is playing the guitar, you'll see him just move that guitar into a vertical position, and this isn't him showing off. This is allowing him to move closer to the mic when they want to increase that dynamic range, to get slightly more volume to the vocal. He now is able to get closer to the microphone to get a more dramatic effect, to give a slightly different feel to the vocal, just making it slightly louder, and then also give them the option in the next verse to then drop away from the mic a little bit. So all of these tiny details that have been rehearsed in order to give that dynamic range and to make an interesting journey out of this performance. When you're listening out purely for those dynamic changes, they are really obvious. You'll hear it getting louder and then getting softer, and you'll be able to tell as well the way that when they're closer to the microphones and they sing a little bit louder, when they move away from the microphones, they can sing at that same volume, but obviously it's going to be slightly quieter. You're going to get more of the ambient space that they're singing in involved with that sound. But then also when they're far away from the mics and they sing softly, you start to get an appreciation of how different they can make each line sound and each part of the song sound just by their position in relation to the microphone, but also the way that they're using their vocal cords, really leaning in, getting more of a connection with those vocal cords, but then putting a little bit more air through those vocal cords to get that softer sound. So with such a stripped back performance, these tiny details become so important because they're under the microscope. There's nowhere to hide. And also the way that they've arranged this vocally, you'll notice how in the first chorus we've got Peter and Paul supplying that answer, the tagline in the chorus. The answer, my friend, is blowing in the wind. The answer is blowing in the wind. That's Peter and Paul that give it the first time. And then in the second chorus, Mary is now giving the answer to the question. So it's just that variation, and to have a different response in that second chorus to the male vocal that gave the response in the first chorus. You can also draw the parallel with any other band who are a full band. You'll find that in the verse, you just have a voice and maybe just drums, bass, and some keys. If you get into a pre-chorus, then you have more instruments to then join in. And then in the chorus, everything's in. And you want that dynamic change for the chorus to have the impact that you're after. Here, these 3 are using their voices in exactly the same way. So Mary starts out in the verse, and then as we progress, Peter comes in with that harmony line. And as we get into the chorus, we've now got Paul adding his baritone range in there. So it is like they're adding instruments into the mix, but the instruments are their voices. It's been arranged in exactly the same way you would arrange it for a full band, but because it is so stripped back, the voices are taking the place of those instruments. Just on that theme as well, throughout the song so far, Mary has been singing the verse, like I said. Peter then comes in with a harmony line, and then we've got Paul in the chorus. In the last verse, all of them are going to be singing in harmony with each other because they've made a journey out of the song. It would just be exactly the same thing if they were to arrange it the same way that they have done previously in the other 2 verses, whereas now we're going to be getting into an all-in verse just to take you on that different journey. And they end the track with a decrease dynamically to then finish in such a place where you can think about the lyrics, you can think about the meaning of the song, because sometimes you don't want to end on a crescendo, especially if it's a song that has a deeper meaning to it and you want your audience to think at the end. You don't necessarily want them to be jumping about and going crazy, because there's a message that has been given to the audience throughout the song, and you'll find this at the end of the song when we get back into it, that dynamic decrease in volume towards the end of the song that just leaves you in that place of thinking and not in that place of excitement. It's something that is used all the time musically, especially in folk music. You want people to be able to think at the end of the song, and that's exactly what we get here. So let's get back into the performance and appreciate that.
will it take till he knows that too many people have died? The answer, my friend, is blowing in the wind. The answer is blowing in the wind. The answer is blowing in the wind.
And there we have it. When you're looking out for those dynamic changes, they are so obvious, but so well executed. And at the end there as well, listen to the way that we start to take the dynamics down on the guitars as well, just picking ever so more lightly and also strumming lightly as well. If they were just belting this out the whole time, it wouldn't have the same effect. It's been perfectly executed and arranged in order to make you think and to have that connection. It's great to see as well a totally live performance with 3 people that can sing in harmony with each other, 2 guys that can play the guitar and accompany themselves. We have got the stand-up bass here in the background, just supplying that bottom end. But musically, the way that they've approached this and the way that they've arranged it, all of these tiny details that unless you're looking out for them, you might not notice them. It's great because we can just sit back and appreciate a great live performance. Just to mention Peter, Paul and Mary in terms of their full names, we have Peter Yarrow and Noel Paul Stokey and Mary Travers. I do want to get into the background of the band and how it all started because there's some interesting stuff in there. They were put together by Albert Grossman, who was holding auditions for a band. If you can imagine it, it's like a better version of Simon Cowell back in the early 60s, because we're talking 1961 here. So these 3 turned up to the auditions, as well as lots of other musicians and artists who wanted to be in a band. But of course the level and the bar was set a bit higher in the early 60s, so they had to be able to sing in harmony with other people, but also play an instrument, which is luckily something that we got from Peter and Paul. Another important thing to mention is that back in the early 60s, it wasn't about image. It was all about musicianship and ability and talent. And you needed all of those things if you were going to get any time on the radio or any time on TV. You had to be better than all the other bands around at the time. So once these 3 were put together in 1961, they then recorded an album which was released on Warner Brothers in 1962. And that was just called Peter, Paul and Mary. And that was a monster hit. It went straight to #1 and stayed there for 7 weeks. It sold over 2 million copies, therefore going double platinum. So they followed that up with Moving in 1963, and that's a massive hit album. Got to #2 in the charts, and from that album, they released the single Puff the Magic Dragon, and that got to #2 as a single, so that was a massive hit in its own right. The same year, 1963, another album came along that was called In the Wind, and this went to #1 in the charts, another massive hit, and it was a hit over here in the UK as well. Got to #11, and the year after that, 1964, is when they released their live album, which was called In Concert. And again, that did really well here. It got to #20 in the charts. Over in the USA, it got up to #4. In 1965, they released A Song Will Rise, and they got to #8 in the charts, so another massively successful album, gold certified. And then the same year, See What Tomorrow Brings got to #11 in the charts and was gold certified again. So another couple of very successful albums. I won't have time to get through all of the albums and their chart positions in this video, but another notable album that really does stick out is album 1700, because that included their final big hit, at least the only hit that got to #1, which was Leaving on a Jet Plane, which their good friend wrote, who I featured last night, John Denver, and he was singing that with Cass Elliot, so you can check out that video if you want to. Just to throw in a quick interesting fact about album 1700, because it sounds like quite a cool album name, a bit edgy. The reason that it's called that is that is what it's called in the vaults of Warner Brothers. It just happened to be album number 1700, and it's registered in the mono version as W1700, and in the stereo version is WS1700. A lot of people will know Peter, Paul and Mary for doing versions of other people's songs, but they did have their own stuff. Peter wrote Puff the Magic Dragon that I mentioned earlier, and that was based on a poem written by Leonard Lipton. So there is original material mixed in there as well. Another important thing to note mentally is that they're covering songs that are being performed by artists around at the same time. For example, Bob Dylan, he had an album out that had been out for 4 months called The Freewheeling Bob Dylan, and there's a track from that called Don't Think Twice, It's Alright. And because Peter, Paul and Mary covered that and had success with it, it increased Bob Dylan's album sales and got it into the top 30 of the charts, even though it had been out for 4 months. So these artists were covering each other's songs around at the time. It was just sharing that musical material, and they were all just helping each other. This song is a great example of that because it's a Bob Dylan song, but everybody will know the Peter, Paul and Mary version of it because it was such a big hit for them. And moving into 1969, because this is when Leaving on a Jet Plane got to number 1, even though it had been released previously 2 years earlier on album 1700, which I mentioned earlier. It didn't hit number 1 until 1969. That was the same year that they released Peter, Paul and Mommy. Trying to do my American accent. Here we don't have the word mommy, it's mommy with a U, but you know what I mean. That was a Grammy-winning album as well, and on that album was the single Day Is Done, and that was the final top 100 hit that they had in the charts. From 1970 is when they went their own separate ways to pursue their solo careers, and they did get back together in 1972 for a show at Madison Square Garden, and that was part of a presidential campaign. They returned there in 1978, and this was a nuclear energy protest, and in 1978 they got together properly after playing at that event. They then did a tour and a reunion album, and because it was so popular, they then decided in 1981 to get back together and tour properly and continuously. So they recorded a couple of albums in the 80s, another 2 in the 90s, and they were performing shows, roughly 45 a year, all the way up until 2009. And that's when, unfortunately, Mary passed away. She was diagnosed with leukemia in 2004, and she had a bone marrow transplant in that same year. In 2007, she had her second surgery, and during all this time, she was still performing for people, still battling on. In 2009, she did stop performing because of the illness, and unfortunately, she did pass away in September of 2009 due to complications with the chemotherapy that was being used to treat the leukemia. And by the way, you can still catch Peter and Paul performing live. They've got dates up on their website in 2020, so if you are over in the USA, you can go and catch some of those dates. But fortunately, we can look back at a video like this and see Peter, Paul and Mary in full flow, and the way that their voices interact but also harmonize, and being able to accompany themselves as well on stage. Just as a final footnote, they were inducted into the Vocal Group Hall of Fame in 1999. But thank you guys so much for suggesting this video for me to take a look at, and keep those suggestions coming in the comments below. Let me know what you guys think, and if you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe, and I'll see you guys at the next one.